when you come to Saved Through Childbearing, knowing who Artemis is and knowing in the time of Paul that she is the midwife, she's a goddess of midwifery. Mm-hmm. So people are going to her temple for two things. They're either when they're pregnant, which is the number one cause of death, by the way. Everybody knows somebody for women or for men, death by birth for women. And so they're going to her temple, and our best guess is they're saying, either deliver me safely or kill me quickly with your euthanizing arrows. So it makes sense that Paul, as a pastor concerned for the welfare of his sheep that he's entrusted to Timothy, wants to assure them that in the shadow of the goddess of midwifery, Jesus is stronger.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Sandra Glahn. She is professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary and the author of the excellent new book, Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. This is a really excellent in-depth historical analysis of the goddess Artemis and her importance for study of the New Testament. Dr. Glahn, part of her story comes out of trying to make sense of 1 Timothy 2:15 and what it means that she or the woman will be saved through childbearing. What are the implications there? What is Paul saying? And really, what is he saying in that whole passage there? We get into it. So we have a good conversation about that. It's always a tricky but important text to work through. If you're new to this channel, please do make sure to subscribe. We'd appreciate that. If you'd like and comment, that would be fantastic as well. And definitely turn on your notifications so you get all of our future content. We are a nonprofit group that does ministry both digitally in these spaces, and we have on-ground classes that are also joined by people online constantly. We're trying to make high-quality biblical scholarship available. And so if you're interested in supporting us at all, you can become a member of the Center for Bible Study for as little or as much as you'd like. Any monthly recurring donation makes you a member of the center. What that does is you'll get access to all of our past classes that we've taught. I just finished a 4-week class on biblical interpretation. We're teaching another 4-week class on the Gospel of Mark coming up shortly. So we've got all the past classes that you get access to, and you get entrance into all the future classes as well. There are other perks if you're interested. So you can follow the link in the description there. There's a link to become a member. There's also links to all of Dr. Glahn's books. I encourage you to check those out. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Glahn. Welcome, everybody, back to the podcast. I am so delighted here to have my guest, Dr. Sandra Glahn, with me. We are going to be discussing her book, Nobody's Mother, fantastic new study of the context of Artemis of Ephesus and why it matters for interpreting the New Testament. Well, it's true. It's true. And we'll be talking about some of her other works as well. She's just done a lot of really wonderful scholarship and is continuing to do so. I saw you have two new contracts with IVP on the way. The ad came out. So
maybe a sign of mental, I don't know.
Perhaps, right? Yeah, we sign up for these things and then we were like, why did we do that? But thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, Dr. Glahn. It's really a treat. Pleasure. Yeah. So just to begin, could you give us a little bit of your background, your faith journey, and your path to biblical studies? That's something that I know you touch on a little bit in the opening of the book, and I think it's something the audience would really connect with.
Oh, thank you. Well, I had this mother who, if you've seen Sound of Music, whether Carrie Underwood's version or, Julie Andrews's, my mother was very much like that. It was just wonderful. And I'm the fourth of 5 kids. So I had one vision for my vocation, and that was motherhood. Married my high school sweetheart, great guy. We've been together for 45 years now. But when we hit the brick wall of infertility and pregnancy loss, it was an absolutely stunning shock to me. It wasn't just an ethical, bioethical, financial, marital, all of that challenge. At its core, for me, it was a spiritual crisis because I had no vision for what it looked like to be a Christian woman who wasn't married with kids. And that sent me on a journey to figure out, how did I get there? What did my little vision of the world do for single women? And then I would learn church history and go, the early church was really into celibacy. Where did I get this idea that the nuclear family was certainly it's God ordained and it's blessed, but it's not the only calling for a woman.
Mm.
And a big key to that is how we read the little enigmatic phrase in 1 Timothy, she will be saved through childbearing. And in my early days as a Christian, I was taught that that's what it was saying, that not that I would go to heaven based on having babies, but it was kind of close, actually, that this was
Yeah.
the one vision. And so that began for me a long, long journey of exploring, well, what does that mean? And my husband decided to pursue pastoral ministries. I went to Bible college thinking I'm going to be the perfect, pastor's wife for him. But in the process, I'm getting my own spiritual life. I'm seeing the text for myself. I put him through seminary and he's done with seminary, and I'm, teaching all this time, going through infertility treatment. It spanned a decade for us. And I'm teaching women's Bible study in my church. And this is before the internet. So I'm kind of isolated at home now. I have a freelance writing business. And so I start seminary. I don't think women should get seminary degrees at this point in my life. This is my mentality at the time. But I'm going to class, taking one class at a time just to get out of the house and interact with other people, because I'm teaching a Bible study at church. And as it turns out, if you do that long enough, you have a degree. So, okay, I'm kind of being a little facetious, but in the process, my professors knew that this was usually the term project I was focusing on, was this question. Whether I'm in Genesis doing exegesis in Hebrew, whether I am looking at Luke in the New Testament, I am exploring this journey of where did we go wrong on our messaging for women here, and what does the Bible actually say? That's kind of a really short version. As you well know, it's in the intro to Nobody's Mother, and really sets up that journey of why 1 Timothy and why this enigmatic phrase, which is really the subject of the book, and why Artemis is important.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And a really cool insight. I think a lot of the best scholarship actually comes out of personal narrative. I had a friend of mine, he had a different PhD advisor, a guy I really, really respect a lot. And I remember when he was wrestling with what to write for his dissertation, he said something to his advisor like, well, I don't have a theological dog in this fight or whatever, kind of like, I'm neutral. And his advisor looked back at him and he said, well, you should. And I just think, the point wasn't like, hey, we should just be biased and enforce, everything on the text, but that most of actually the best scholarship comes out of a place of really caring. Yes, exactly.
Then you put in checks and balances to make sure that your bias isn't driving it, and that's where you get vetting and all of that. But I think on the one hand, it's dangerous when you come to a text with your own personal story. But it's also dangerous to come to the text without any sense of anyone's personal story. I think that's why we need each other. We need men and women. We need Americans and Africans, and we need dead Christians and living Christians. This is why we need community. Yeah. And I think there's been a tendency to think, well, if somebody is approaching a topic from their story as a starting place, that makes them suspect. But it's just as true that the opposite is the case. And I'll give you an example. I remember sitting in a Sunday school class while I was wrestling with bioethical issues relating to in vitro. And the teacher, who had not been through any of this, said, well, if you just look at the price of in vitro, it's just not good stewardship. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, okay, but because I'm in this and I know we have unexplained infertility, I know that it's more than just a price tag of getting a child. I want to know what's medically wrong, and does it need to be fixed, because infertility is a symptom of something else. It's not like an end diagnosis. And that was a great example that sort of solidified in my head why you have to have both. We needed him as a scholar on bioethics, but we needed somebody who was actually living in it to have some questions brought that you might not think of if you hadn't actually lived in the situation.
Oh, that's a great example. Yeah. On page 14 of the book, you write this. I think it's a helpful kind of starting point to talk about your approach to the historical question. You say, this book is for the reader who wants to avoid sacrificing a high view of Scripture while working to reconcile conflicting narratives about God's view of women. So I'm wondering, what sort of approach or approaches to Paul's language about women do you have in mind that you might think do sacrifice a high view of Scripture, and how do you want your approach to differ there?
So one is, well, Paul's just a misogynist when he's saying, saved through childbearing.
Yeah.
Yeah. One is that, well, Paul, bless his little heart, he just had an undeveloped view of men and women, but we're more enlightened. Neither of which I think is very charitable to Paul. He's a brilliant scholar, like just brilliant. If you look at Romans from start to finish, you're like, eh. And then if you think about maybe time in Arabia before he actually started teaching, I'm thinking he knew Genesis 1-3 pretty well and had a really deeply rooted view of gender. And if you look at Romans 12, that is his actual practice in all his greetings and the women he's greeting and the different kinds of relationships, you've got benefactor and one is like a mom and coworker. And so Paul's, boots on the ground approach to women has to be added to his words on the paper. And then there are some who say, well, that's not actually Pauline teaching at all. It's just some person who came along, 100 years later and faked.
Right. A later author.
Yeah. Which, not everybody who has a low view of scripture thinks that, but I think that the reasons sometimes given are like Paul's different vocabulary. We can totally account for that without putting somebody else behind the pen in a different century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Yeah, so you just listed off a number of really common angles on Paul in scholarship, right? That he's a man of his time, and therefore we should expect him to be a misogynist. So whatever, or maybe he has some like a nucleus of an egalitarian strand there, but it's underdeveloped, or it wasn't Paul. And so your approach is different than that. What are your assumptions as you're reading Paul?
So as I dug, and part of how I came to the text was assuming Paul is smart and Paul's not contradicting himself. So for example, if you're looking at 1 Corinthians 11, when he talks about women praying and prophesying, and in 1 Corinthians 14, he talks about women being silent. I think Paul's too smart to contradict himself within 3 chapters.
Right.
So I'm going to assume that maybe we've misunderstood what he meant by silence. And so I think that the evidence suggested that Paul has, and Romans 16, that Paul has a positive view of women and he's partnering with women. And when he writes in the beginning of his letter to the Philippians and he's talking about their partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, well, who was there on the first day? It was the women at the prayer meeting. And Paul didn't say, oh dear, it's the women meeting. I'm going to have to go find some, Jewish guys to meet with. No, he plants a church with the women that are gathering for prayer. So I'm assuming Paul has a high view of women and he has a pretty developed view of gender. And then the more I dug into the first century backgrounds and the inscriptions, the more I really felt like even the language that he used was consistent with somebody who's writing a personal letter, Timothy, who might know him well, as opposed to the Romans, which are people he's never met. There are things that I would explain if I were writing to people I had never met versus somebody who'd been my ministry partner for years and years, right? That can account for some of it. I think some of it can be accounted for by the fact that he is writing to a context where you have this goddess who is all over the inscriptions at the time of the earliest Christians. She's just dominating. But actually, where do we get that? We don't just get that from the inscriptions. Our jumping off point of that is Luke, because he's writing in Acts 19 about the magic workers and then the Artemis worshipers. So he's the one who told us we kind of got kicked out of the synagogue. And so that tells us there are both Jewish Christians in the early church, and the magic burning tells you there are Gentile Christians in the early church, or else Jewish people that were really into magic, which is real sketchy. And the fact that he is an apostle of the Gentiles, all that suggests there's a good chance that there are Jews and Gentiles in this church. And sometimes scholars look at just First Timothy without looking beyond it and say, yeah, it's just all Jewish influences here.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, it's you're right. Acts is the one god that really Paul comes into direct conflict with that's named is Artemis.
And he never says her name like a good Jew. I think Luke was probably Gentile. There's some debate, but Luke, in a number of different places in Luke Acts, will say the names of gods. I thought he was Hermes. Paul, you will never see him write ascribe whatever, but utter the name of another god. And so I think he's going to say things like, the fiery arrows
Yeah, yeah,
That's a
yeah.
goddess that's toting around with her in a bow and arrow. He doesn't have to say her name. It'd be like
Right.
me saying kryptonite, and people would know exactly which superhero I'm talking.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good point. Yeah. So, okay, so we're talking Artemis then. I guess it's maybe obvious to somebody, or maybe not, who's been in the New Testament a bit, like why Artemis might be interesting.
Like,
But
what in the world does she have to do with Save Your
people, I think
Child?
for most people,
Yeah.
sitting in church or who maybe have interest in Christianity, they might wonder like, oh wow, why write a book about Artemis of Ephesus? What makes her so important for New Testament interpretation outside of Acts 18, 19?
Especially if you're trying to solve the enigmatic phrase "save through childbearing." What in the
Right.
world does
Yeah, because
yeah
it's
to do with
not mentioned there.
that?
In
Right.
fact,
Yeah.
I was talking with a group of young Christian leaders. That was like a school of ministry in my area. They had asked me to come out and speak about women in ministry, and so of course one of the passages we talk about at some point is the First Timothy passage. And I was talking to them about where some cultural codes or cues that maybe point to an Artemis background. And the question that one student asked me, I think kind of skeptically, well, why doesn't Paul just come out and say it, right? That this is what he's
Yeah.
talking about. So this is your area, right?
So yeah, I think two reasons. Number one, Timothy, if Timothy's been side by side with him, and the last thing that happened to Paul before he left Ephesus was the big brouhaha of people chanting in the theater for 2 hours, great as Artemis of the Ephesians. He's already planning to leave for Macedonia and just speeds up the timeline and is out of there. It's not safe. And so that would be the last thing on his mind as he's writing back to Timothy. And he says, I've left you in Ephesus to teach certain people not to teach false doctrine. I don't think he had to tell Timothy what false doctrine we're talking about. They had just lived through it all. So I get the Artemis as the background by beginning in, as I mentioned, Luke, Acts 19, written by Luke. I sometimes accidentally say Luke 19 because Luke wrote it. And that's why I keep talking about Luke.
It's part two of Luke. Yeah.
That's right. Part 2, the sequel. He has given us a lot of detail about what is, if you'll pardon the anachronistic reference to the religious context in Ephesus. You really can't suss out religion and cult of religion in the city. It's like talking about the freedom in America as if, that's not in our DNA. So Paul is confronted by these silver workers who are yelling great as Artemis of the Ephesians in this story as Luke reports it. And he says they have not blasphemed the goddess. And I'm thinking, yeah, they haven't said her name. They've just said things like God's made with hands. Wink, wink. Right? Because there are statues in the temple, but it's a brilliant missiological move. But that is the main place I'm getting my clues for what could be going on in the background. But also the magic workers are described earlier in the same passage in Acts. And for years, I didn't make the connection of magic workers and their lingo showing up in the pastoral epistles. But when you have that reference, which again appears to be misogynistic when Paul talks about women being gossips and busybodies, probably better translated, speakers of nonsense. And it's a cognate or the form of one of the very words used for magic workers in Acts 19. It's a magic-y word. So something that was happening with magic is also showing up in First Timothy. But also when you come to save through childbearing, knowing who Artemis is and knowing in the time of Paul that she is the midwife, she's a goddess of midwifery. So people are going to her temple for two things. They're either when they're pregnant, which is the number one cause of death, by the way. Everybody knows somebody for women or for men, death by birth for women. And so they're going to her temple, and our best guess is they're saying, either deliver me safely or kill me quickly with your euthanizing arrows. There's all kinds of inscriptions and literary backgrounds that suggest that her arrows were connected with pain-free euthanizing. Her own mother is said to have had a pain-free delivery because Artemis had that ability, it was believed. So it makes sense that Paul, as a pastor concerned for the welfare of his sheep that he's entrusted to Timothy, wants to assure them that in the shadow of the goddess of midwifery, Jesus is stronger. And this is my conclusion, was that this is limited application. I don't think that he's telling all women they won't die in childbirth. Lots of women through the centuries have died in childbirth. I don't even think he's telling all first century Christians they won't die in childbirth. I think in the same way that in Acts 19, you have people just touching, Paul touches a cloak, they bring a cloak to him or they bring a handkerchief to him, and people are healed. And this makes the magic workers burn their books. Mm-hmm. I think in the same way that Paul's doing miraculous healings in a very localized situation to prove that Jesus is stronger than magic and its effect on the gospel, I think he's doing the same thing with the goddess of midwifery and the women in the congregation when it comes to Artemis. I think it's a limited application. It's written in a personal letter to Timothy. It has great application for us for missions and to be looking at strongholds in cultures, then that Jesus is stronger than all the strongholds. And different cultures are going to have different strongholds. Maybe in America, it's sex and greed. Maybe not in that order. I don't know, right? But Jesus is better. Jesus is stronger. And that Paul, as a good pastor and as shepherd, is concerned for what is going to concern them.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah. I have more questions about the exegesis of that whole text too, which we can come back to, but maybe could we just go back a little bit? Because you spend a lot of time in the book unpacking who Artemis is culturally in Paul's world. And I mean, you talked about her as a midwife, but you also correct some misconceptions that people had, namely that she was a fertility goddess and nurturing and many people, if they've seen a picture of her, they've seen that one where a lot of people assume she's like many-breasted, and so that's kind of fertility. So maybe could you unpack a little bit more about just what you find in the book and what others have argued in terms of who she is in that culture?
I'd love to. Yeah. So we're trying to solve for X, and X is who is Artemis, not just who is Artemis, but who is Artemis at the time of the earliest Christians in Ephesus. Right. Because if you get a synoptic Artemis, you can go back, you can have 11 centuries worth of Artemis in different locations with different names. Mm-hmm. And then you have Diana in the same city. It's the same woman. In the same way, I like to liken it to the Statue of Liberty. France gave us a Statue of Liberty. It's Lady Liberty enlightening the world. And they have their own version of her in Paris, but only one of those two is connected with immigration. Mm. Same goddess, same statue, but in one locale, she takes on a local flavor. And the same thing is happening with Artemis. So I had to know, who is she at the time of the earliest Christians, and how am I going to narrow that down? So I began with the ancient stories. I began with Homer, 10 centuries earlier. I began by looking at different writings in the literature, but then I fast forwarded to the time of the earliest Christian. And we look at what are the literary sources saying about her in Ephesus now? What do the inscriptions in Ephesus say about her here now? And just narrow it down to about 100-year period, the two first centuries. And what emerges is Artemis in Ephesus is a goddess of midwifery. Everywhere she's carrying a bow and arrow. And even in the temple in Ephesus, you have both statues. You have the statue of the young, beautiful maiden with a short skirt so she can hunt, flanked often by a deer or dogs, with a bow and arrow. She's got a quiver. Sometimes she's reaching back for a bow. But also you have that bizarre looking creature with bulbous appendages all over her. And she's got a bee on her side, and looks like bulls that look like they're in trauma. And what does all of that mean? And it's the same goddess. It's just a very different manifestation. The analogy I like to give on that is like there are 1,000 versions of Barbie. It's all the same Barbie, but in different places and different cultures, she looks different, but she still has the same backstory. She's still from Mattel. So that's a strange thing going on with that manifestation of the visual picture, because we don't really have a good parallel. Maybe we do, in that if you go to Nazareth and the Church of the Incarnation or the Annunciation, one of those two. I get them mixed up. Anyway, what they did when they were building the church modernly is they asked different countries from all over the world to send a Madonna and child in art from their country. So you have a Bolivian-looking mother and child. You have America, looks like Metallica and child. You have, in Greece, you have the very traditional iconography of mother and child. And you can take a little trip around the world, and people the mother and child, the Madonna and baby looking of very different ethnicities and nationalities. And so you get these local manifestations of the same story. You see something similar maybe in the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is not the Virgin of Dallas, right? And so they have these different manifestations of Artemis. Who is she at the time of the earliest Christians? In Ephesus, best we can tell from all the data that we narrow down. Goddess of midwifery. Those bulbous appendages are not breasts. They are probably Hittite sacs that are related to magic, and that they are missing some essential details for feeding children, namely nipples. They look more like eggs, or like the opposite of a honeycomb, like what would it look like if you pulled the wax out and it retained its shape. She often does have a honeycomb at her feet because the bee is the mascot of the city of Ephesus.
Oh, it's really fascinating. Yeah, that's so cool. So how would you say, I guess one other facet to this picture I'd love for you to fill in for us before we return back to the Timothy text is the role of female priestesses in the Artemis cult, and also the mythology of her relationship to her brother and coming first, and how that might be interesting.
Good point.
Yes, and I forget what was the name of the Amazon women as well that were connected to her.
Huge connection. Like if you go to Ephesus today, which I imagine some of your listeners and viewers have done, you will see the Amazon story in stone. At approximately, again, the time of the earliest Christians, the story is being told. There was a huge connection to the Amazon women and Artemis. And if you Google like the Smithsonian or National Geographic, you will see that graves have been found in what we today call the country of Georgia, that says these were not mythological, actually. These were real warrior women. And so they had a strong connection to Artemis, as you can imagine. She's the perfect, mascot for them. She's carrying a bow and arrow, and she's a hunter. And one of the myths I wanted to lay to rest is that she's a man-hater. She is not a man-hater. She is a confirmed virgin. But one of the things the inscriptions show us, and even a reference in the book of Titus in the New Testament, you will find men's names that are derivatives of hers. Artemis is one of Paul's colleagues. And in the inscriptions, you would find men and women are naming their children, boys and girls, after Artemis. And if you think about the silver workers that Luke describes, those are male silver workers. This is not just a girl cult. However, it looks like those with access in the inner courts of the temple are probably sexually inactive women. And there is a huge connection to wealth. The city is, and there are lots of references to wealth in 1 Timothy. And the best analogy I can think of that is if you have a junior league or you have cotillion, you have the wealthy women of the town. And this is a world where municipal bonds are not paying for the gymnasium. Somebody is paying for it and getting their name in very big letters. So one of the biggest things you find in inscriptions is the name of whoever had something built. It's not that different from at the school where I teach. We have a brick walk, and the donors can pay to honor their children or their wives or themselves.
It's the same thing today. I just moved back to California. I'd been living in Grand Rapids for a few years, and there's just a couple Dutch names that are plastered over everywhere in the city, and it speaks pretty loudly to whose city it is.
Yes. So you have this. You could say girl power, but I think that was really misunderstood, because then it was applied to Paul, and it was saying that Paul's fighting this sort of feminazi mentality. That's not what's happening in the city at all. There wasn't men against women, but there is a possibility that there was sort of a pride of firstborn, and that could come from. So Homer begins the story. As the story is told, Zeus, the big daddy god, cheats on his wife, Hera, with Leto. Leto conceives twins. She flies all over the empire looking for a friendly place to land, and nobody wants to allow her because they don't want to cross the angry wife. But eventually she finds a grove of trees called Ortygia near Ephesus, and she gives birth to Artemis. Artemis is born first, and so she's the firstborn, and you see first as part of her name. First throne is one of her names in the inscriptions in Ephesus, Protos.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me that, so then she watches her mother ride for 9 days, giving birth to Apollo. And how long Mama rides is different according to different literary sources, but in general, it's a really long time. And she says, there is no way I am ever going through that. Now, they're not born, gods and goddesses aren't born as little cherubs or little babies. They're born like little bonsais where they're fully mature. They're just tiny, but they have full use of their faculties. Artemis goes to her dad, sits on his lap, strokes his beard, which is the equivalent of batting your eyes at him and, wrapping him around your fingers. Says, Daddy, make me immune to Aphrodite's arrows. I don't want anything to do with sex or children. And he says, granted. And I looked for one inscription with the name Apollo anywhere in the city. I found nothing. It's like he is erased from the memory of the city. His city is Delos. How Delos is claiming that the twins were born there, I don't know. They're claiming it too. But all of that to say, this is Artemis' city. This is not her brother. And she is the first. And if you know twins, you know that that's the first question a lot of people still ask.
Yeah, that's true. That is
Which
true.
one of you first? Who cares? Like, we're talking 15 minutes, but there's something about being first. So I suspect that Paul is looking at this firstborn creation myth and the status that comes with it. And it's not that he's putting down women, it's that he's elevating men to a place of equality with women in a city where the firstborn, and he's like, actually, in the true story, Adam was first. And not only that, the woman was deceived. I don't think he's saying that this is a prototype of all women being deceived. Because over in 2 Corinthians, he says to the church, I'm concerned that all of you, like Eve, will be deceived. It's a human thing to be deceived by the evil one. So it would explain where it's maybe a midrash where Paul is borrowing the outline from the true origin story, and he's throwing serious shade on the local origin story without getting in trouble or getting called a blasphemer.
No, that's really good. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people about the Timothy text, and oftentimes they can be persuaded, I mean, just by the evidence about the language of not teaching and so forth, what might be going on there, and the issue with the word of authority. We could talk about that in a minute, and all that. But then they come back as, well, then why does he ground it in, the creation story? As if the assumption is like that.
That it's been true since the beginning.
Yes,
before the fall.
And rooted
therefore the ideal
is subjugation of women to men. And I think a lot of, so recognizing that there's a very good, at least culturally plausible account for the entire passage with Artemis in the background, I think is really helpful. In other words, you're not just picking and choosing like select places of the passage where maybe it fits, but the entire logic of the argument can plausibly be explained in this way. And I think that's really helpful.
He is giving it as a reasoning for limiting women in this context. And it's so often those who see it as rooted in creation, we're still not going on to deal with, okay, but what does it mean to be saved through childbearing? Because you don't believe people go to heaven by that. And so, but also you don't really believe that the nuclear family is the only way a woman can use the gift of teaching, because, Anna in the temple is prophesying as a widow for a very long time. Yeah. Why is the point made of Philip having prophesying daughters? Well, but even more essential, why do you have men and women, old, young, slave-free, Jew, Gentile, prophesying at Pentecost? And not as a sign of male failure. It's a sign that the Holy Spirit is here. And prophecy, whatever you want to make it, is opening your mouth publicly.
Yeah, it's teaching. Like, there's no way around it.
You have to reconcile all of that. You have to reconcile.
Yeah. I like to put up, there's a list of gifts that Paul mentions in Ephesians. I think it's 3, maybe 4. Where after Christ has ascended on high, this is a citation of Psalm 69. He gives gifts, and the gift that passage is a little bit unique because oftentimes Paul talks about us having different gifts, but in that passage the gifts are actually the people themselves. It's like the spoils of the king are the different gifts he gives to the church, and there's apostles and prophets, and you go down the list, and then there's one of them is teacher, right? Which people today might argue, well, women can't do that. They can't teach. But what's funny about it to me is that you can point to examples in the New Testament where Paul calls women all of those other things on that list: apostle, prophet, and so on and so forth. So
Yes.
for Paul, I don't think anybody could make an argument that teaching is above apostle or prophet or, these things. So it just doesn't hold. It doesn't really
He
make
actually
sense.
ranks them in 1 Corinthians 14.
Right.
So,
I mean, it doesn't really make sense, right? Again, back to your point about consistency. If we're trying to take Paul to be a consistent thinker and a clear thinker, a lot of this stuff just starts to add up, and it's difficult to make sense of with some of the paradigms. Could you then maybe just take us through, just kind of briefly walk through your understanding of the Timothy text, maybe even beginning with what's said about the attire of women and what Paul's doing there, and how he moves from that to then saying, I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, to just all the way through. Just any thoughts you have on that? Yeah, why not?
Now, let me preface it by saying the main thing I wanted people to take away from my work in this book was not what I think are the ramifications for 1 Timothy, actually, other than say through childbearing. I wanted us to stop embarrassing ourselves by calling Artemis a fertility goddess when historians know this is not actually the case at all. And I mean, you hear it everywhere.
To be fair, it is mostly a historical treatment of Artemis, right? And situating that. That's most of the book. Yes,
correct.
yes.
Correct. And who in the world was she at the time of the earliest Christians? And so I start my ramifications section with, just to be clear, like the main thing I was trying to show is, who is she? But sure, I'll take a stab at interpretation, but that's not what I've spent the last 25 years on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time on it. I spent some years on it, but not the quarter of a century that I spent on the other side. So Paul begins the passage actually talking to the men or husbands. And in the Greek, the word for husband is the same word as for man, and the word for woman is the same word as for wife. And so it's an interpretive question as to whether he's addressing husbands and wives or he's addressing men and women. And that has huge ramifications for how we read, let the women keep silent at church, or let the wives keep silent and ask them their husbands at home. And if a woman with a husband at home is wife, right? That's over in Corinthians, but that's just an example of the kind of interpretive questions we have to ask and wrestle with. So it helps to begin by knowing that every translation is an interpretation. And that's not because of malice. It's because you have to make those decisions when you're rendering one language to another. So the first thing we're going to ask is Paul talking to men or husbands? And then later, is he talking to women or wives? That has very different ramifications for how we read it. The husbands, I take it as husbands, so we'll go that way. Okay. They're angry about something, and Paul is telling them to settle down and stop being angry. And that very often gets left out of the teaching on this passage. We go straight for what Paul is saying to the women, but it appears that there's some conflict happening between either men and women or husbands and wives in public setting. And I don't think that Paul is saying men are more given to anger than women are. I think it manifests itself differently. And for the same reason, I don't think we should say women are more easily deceived than men are. Paul is giving some sex-specific commands in this context, but that is not, I don't think we should extrapolate both of those to something.
If we did, we would have to say only men should pray, right? Lifting up holy hands. So women, no praying, no lifting up your hands when you pray.
Causing problems with 1 Corinthians 11, where they're going to pray and prophesy. All kinds of issues, Okay, so then he gets to talking about how he wants the women to act. And he wants them to, he's talking about the way that they dress. And this section has been really, I think, badly abused in purity culture. Purity is a good thing. Purity culture is not a good thing. If you don't know the difference, Google it. There's all kinds of great resources. So Paul is not saying women are too sexually seductive in public. I don't think that's what he's saying. Certainly Paul would be against that. But when he talks about how he wants them to be modest, it's the same way I think that we use the word, he lives in a modest home. She drives a modest car. Because he then spells out what kind of modesty he means. And he's like, not gold, not pearls, not expensive apparel. He doesn't say sexy apparel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And pearls, you're in a harbor city. Pearls are much more common. And actually, there's no such thing as fake pearls, right? Like maybe a smoky glass, but you just don't walk into Walmart and pick up a bunch of costume jewelry. If you're wearing pearls in your hair, you're filthy rich.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, even the men wanted their wives to flaunt it because it honored
It's
them.
a sign of status for the whole family. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, drive the BMW to church, please, right?
Yeah,
Because it makes me look good.
yeah.
And so I think in that section, Paul is saying, leave your emblems of class behind and let your emblems of class be your good works. What you are wearing is the apparel of Christ. And if that's an obstacle for other people, your wealth, then get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or certainly don't bring it to a public space where it's going to, this is the fellowship of the equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not slave. You're slave and free, you're male and female, you're Jew and Gentile, and all of those. Sure, you're still those things, but you're not separating by those in public. So
That's good.
So again, Paul gets a bad rap here because people are like, Paul's policing what women can wear with a ruler. And I think we've misunderstood completely his heart there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just to your point, also, it's a great connection to James chapter 2, where James says, do not hold the faith in proselympsia, in partiality. How would someone know if a person is rich or of high status when they walk into the assembly versus poor, if not for what they're wearing, right?
Or their hair would be braided.
Or their hair, or their style of hair, right? So yeah,
slave labor,
right? Yeah, right, exactly. So that it makes
you're working in the field, you aren't braiding your hair. That's in this context. That means that you have leisure time and you have somebody else to serve you. And you've probably seen some of the statues where people have their hair 14 inches high, and it's curled and it's coiffed, and it's it's a sign of status. Leave it at home. Don't let that. Your sign of status is Christ. That is your calling card here. So he talks about his practice. Then he says, not I permit a woman either to teach or have authority over and it could be husband or man. So let's begin with I'm not permitting. I think too much is made of the present tense, am permitting. But when you combine it with the first person, then you go, okay, Paul's saying this is his practice. He's not permitting this. That's different from saying you shouldn't, the church shouldn't, a woman should not. And sometimes it even gets taught as a woman shouldn't teach. That's not what Paul said. He said, I'm not permitting. And then the question is, what does it mean to teach and have authority? Is it teach in such a way as to usurp authority? Or so is it two things, or is he using it like you or I might say, I'm sick and tired, and it doesn't mean you're ill or you're weary. It means you're, well, it could mean you're weary, right? But so it could be a figure of speech for teach in such a way as to have authority or usurp authority. The KJV translates it usurp authority. This isn't like a new feminist version of this interpretation.
So the verb for people that are interested is authenteo, and it's a little bit tricky because this is the only time it's used in the New Testament. So we have to look elsewhere for usages of it, and the context in which it's used is very alarming. It's language that's violent, it's connected to murder and rape, and suggests some kind of, I don't know, it doesn't suggest a kind of mundane authority. Paul uses other terms for authority all the time. So it is a red flag a little bit. And some have pushed back and said, well, you have the verb to teach, didasko, along with it. So what's the connection between the two? Does didasko being next to it inevitably therefore transform it into a usage of the term that's more kind of mundane, which is how some complementarians I think have tried to frame it. Linda Belleville has argued, well, actually, when you take this with didasko, it's shaping the kind of didaskoing going on, a kind of of usurping authority. So this is just part of the debate right now about exactly how we make sense of this. But
there is a debate over literally every single word.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
So to teach or to have authority, he's using the infinitive form. And so big question there is it one thing or two things. Could one be positive and one be negative? Some have argued that that doesn't happen. I was reading the book of Revelation in the Greek, not trying to show off. I'm just saying last week I saw them used this way, where one's a negative, one's a positive in the same sentence. So the challenge is, where does he get this word authentane to authority? The beginning of that word is I liken to autonomy. It could be the same root, and I suspect Paul's more concerned not with hierarchy but with autonomy and independence here. And it very well could be an Artemis word. This could be like kryptonite to which is why it's such a rare word and why we have trouble finding it. But Paul, as you said, the word for authority is all over the New Testament. It's one of the early vocab words you learn because it's so common, and this is not that word. So there's not a one-to-one correlation between the word for authority and authentate. So he's given women or wives a limitation. Are wives embarrassing their husbands in public? Are they vetting their prophecies in public and shaming them? Like, is there something in the dynamic of the husband and wife between the husband and wife where you have a prophesying woman and that creates some problems culturally? All kinds of questions that raises. So he is putting a limit on here yet. And now he seems to be pivoting to say, but here's the good news. She'll be saved through childbearing. And he's given his argument for why women are to be limited in that for Adam is first and the woman was the one deceived, but good news, she'll be saved through childbearing. And you're like, if they basically continue in the faith. And so that's an interesting little phrase because
it shifts to plural. Yeah, right. It shifts to plural. They.
She will be saved if they.
Yeah.
Which is bad grammar unless you can put quotes around. She will be saved through childbearing, which could very easily be an Artemis saying if she's a midwife. We know Paul uses the word, the structure of something is a saying. He does this a lot. And I even think, so the very next line after that saying is, this is a faithful saying, which we usually put with next chapter. And then we put a colon. If somebody aspires to be an elder, they aspire to a good thing. But some of your listeners may not know that in the Greek, we don't have paragraph divisions. We don't even have periods. It's all in the same sentence. Think of the last text you got that was missing some spaces, and you could still figure out, by the consonants. But I suspect Paul has chosen a local saying and given it a Christian spin. And yes, in this context, she's first, but actually in the Genesis context, the man was first and the woman was actually deceived. Nevertheless, got some bad news. Here's the good news. Something good is going to happen. You're going to be spared. This is a faithful saying, which suggests he's borrowing somebody else's understanding it and giving it his own spin, which he does habitually in the past particular.
Yeah, he does do that quite a bit there. Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. Yeah, I love hearing you kind of set that out. And the idea of it being a slogan that he's quoting and then reframing, I think is really, really interesting. We know he does that a lot, of course. 1 Corinthians is a prime example. But you even have people arguing for this happening in other places as well. And part of what makes it tricky is it's not always overtly marked as it is in other places as well. So you have to kind of rely on things like interpretation, like you just did with noting the grammar difference, shifting from she being delivered to they plural remaining in faith. So yeah, that's awesome. Yeah,
it often gets rendered then women will be saved through childbearing if they continue the faith, basically. But the idea being trying to smooth out the grammatical shift from singular to plural, which again is improper grammar unless you got quotation marks around that. In English, they didn't have quotation marks at all. Part of the problem here, they didn't have quotation marks.
That's right. Well, that's really wonderful. Thanks so much for that. And
I was nerding out.
I love it. Oh my! I know people are going to love this too. It's a passage. Everybody wants to know more about this passage because it's just so confusing, and it's helpful to have it laid out there. So thank you. I'd love to, if we could, also just talk maybe a little bit about some of your other books as well. You have done some books like Vindicating the Vixens, which you put out, you edited, and Sanctifying Sexuality. I think is that the title? Sanctified Sexuality. Yes.
Sanctified Sexuality,
Yeah.
Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World.
Yeah.
Vindicating the Vixens was first. Yeah, both of those are Kriegel academic titles. The Nobody's Mother is a IVP academic title. Vindicating the Vixens was a brainchild of about 10 years of me collecting articles and writers. So I was a magazine editor for what is today DTS, Dallas Seminary magazine, but we called it Kindred Spirit at the time. And one that really stood out to me, there was an Arab scholar who's now with the Lord, but he taught at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he did a book on Arabs in the shadow of Israel. And he said, I don't think the way that you are reading Ishmael is a full treatment. I mean, he's called a prince. He's given some great promises. And honestly, I had to go, really? And sure enough, there you have it. And he said, so when he is told you're going to be, we have translated as a donkey and not the very nice translation of the word donkey. He said, but if you look at what Jesus is writing on his coronation day, it's what Solomon wrote on his coronation day. And it's what, people in the time of, that's the BMW of the Middle East. And I think you should be understanding that as a white stallion, a wild stallion, a free stallion. Your people are never going to be under slavery. And then he applied it and helped me see Hagar through totally new eyes. Hagar has run away from an abusive mistress that we often give a pass because we identify with Sarah. But God sees her and she names God. El Roy, you're the God who sees. It's a naming formula, friends. Like she is, which some people say means you have authority over. I think this hurts that argument. But anyway, you have this amazing encounter with Hagar who goes back to slavery because God tells her to, but she goes with these incredible promises. Yeah, I'm sending you back, but your son is going to be a free stallion and your people will be free. And the Bedouins have never had anybody reigning over them since. And that blew my mind as a new look at Hagar. And then I began to read other writers who were doing something similar with Bathsheba and, the rape story and how we have made that an affair and mutual. And that wrecks what the author is trying to show us through David's downward spiral. He took. You're the man. She's a sheep. She is not, the finger isn't pointed at her. Lynn Cohick looks at the woman at the well and says, why are you saying that she is a loose woman? First of all, that's not how the church has understood her until the Reformation. Second of all, she's not changing the subject. She is looking for Messiah, and Jesus has gone out of his way to go to find her and say, have I got good news? Go, Amy, I'm it. He doesn't do that with anybody else. And why have we thought she's a loose woman? Well, because she had 6 husbands, but number one cause of war, of death for men is war. Right. She could be widowed 6 times. She could be dumped. The man you have now is not your own. Doesn't mean she's shacking up with some guy. It could mean that she has to be a concubine so she can eat because she cannot put on her high heels and go get a job. Right. She's depending on a man to eat. Yeah. So all of these, so I have men, women, Americans outside the U.S., complementarians, egalitarians, all of them scholars on these different women, and compiled a book where we relook at the women I think have been wrongly vilified in the Bible. And all of these authors donated their writing and scholarship expertise so that all of the author profits on this book go to benefit the International Justice Mission. That's so cool. We felt like that was an appropriate way to support women who are vilified, sexualized, marginalized through our scholarship.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I've got it here, and it's a fantastic book. I really encourage people to check it out. And would you maybe say a couple things as well about Sanctified Sexuality?
Sanctified Sexuality, sure. Yeah. So that's co-authored with Dr. Gary Barnes, my colleague in the counseling department at DTS. And our concern for that book was rooted in, if we rewind back to the Supreme Court decision about gay marriage, we were very disturbed about how some of our fellow evangelicals were talking about some of the issues in terms of their tone. Really deeply offensive, not Christ-like ways of talking about this. And we looked at each other and said, you know what, this is on us. We're training leaders. We need a course where we aren't the experts, but we are bringing in experts on transsexuality, homosexuality, celibacy, rape, and we know who they are. Mark Yarhouse is incredible
Mhm.
with transsexual issues. Wesley Hill has an amazing testimony about being a celibate Christian. So we didn't have to be the experts. We just had to know who the experts were. So we created a course that introduced our students to all of these topics from the people who really knew. And then the book was a result of each person in that lineup volunteering to contribute a chapter.
Yeah, it's got quite an array too of topics that are treated in it. So yeah, that's really cool. And that's all you that was all from one course at DTS.
It was
Is that
all
right?
one course.
Wow.
Correct.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. So
We
that's
don't teach
awesome.
it, we just curate it.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? That's sometimes what you have to do. I was at an all-male Bible faculty at Grand Rapids Seminary, and I wanted to offer a course on women in Scripture and in the church. And so I had to bring in a lot of guest speakers because I certainly didn't want to be a man teaching it, by
Token
myself.
woman? Yeah, no,
Yeah.
you're not her.
Yeah. So,
Bless you.
so yeah, no, it's you have to. And I mean, I think that that's part of the beauty of the body as well, like leaning on each other's gifts, celebrating each other's gifts, doing things collaboratively. Scholarship, biblical scholarship in particular, has often been, I think, pretty unchristian in how it operates, competitive and egotistical and individualistic. And I think that the more we can work together and just celebrate each other and lean on each other's gifts, the better it is, not just for everybody else, but also for ourselves, for those of us that are in this.
Yeah. I mean, imagine what I've learned through interacting with these scholars around the world, men and women, people with expertise in areas where people are asking me questions and I don't know the answers, but fortunately now I know who I can point them to. Yeah. Good, solid research. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time, except could you give us maybe just a really quick preview of the books you have under contract with IVP? Yeah. What are you up to? Yeah.
So the working title of the next one is A Woman's Places in the Story. And it's revisiting, if you preach through Genesis and you're skipping the story of Tamar, you're missing where Judah got his character arc. Mm-hmm. And so, sometimes the women's stories get pulled out as cameos if they're told at all. There's a reason there are so many Marys in the New Testament. They're all named after Miriam. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, she's a prophet. Mm-hmm. She's a leader in Israel. And so it's getting away sort of from what we did in Vixens, which I totally stand behind, but that was cameoing. Mm-hmm. Now I'm wanting to help us tell the whole story of Scripture, but make sure that we include the women that were included. You got the 4 daughters of Zelophehad, and their story is told no fewer than 3 times in the Old Testament. Nobody in my church that I know of knows who those people are. They will when I'm done.
Nice. I love it. That's so cool.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much again for your time, your scholarship. It's such a blessing, and fun to connect with you. And I know people are going to love the episode, so thanks so much.
Fun to nerd out.
It's fun to nerd out. That's what we do here. Thanks. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.